Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining me today. Today we're going to talk about subject matter that's very dear to me, and that is, first of all, performance nutrition. Performance nutrition with the basic application and driving force of ketones. The second subject we'll talk about is recovery. Now, although ketones can play into that recovery if they're executed properly, we've got a second technology that can assist as an anti-inflammatory and an agent that will alleviate many of the inhibitors that can contribute to a lack of anabolism after training. So, one of the keys for athletes in their objective to improve performance is to, first of all, be able to perform and execute their activity in a way that's efficient and reduces oxidative stress so they can last longer in an endeavor, but also to recover faster. The faster you recover, the sooner you can get back into your cycle. So if you're a bodybuilder, for example, you're training a body part, if it's sore when your next training day comes around, you really shouldn't be training it hard because that soreness is indicative of inflammation. Your body's not recovered, and you're kind of, degrading tissue that hasn't generally recovered at its full capacity. So we're going to talk about how we can achieve better results, faster results, from a guy, me, that has been involved in the bodybuilding arena personally. I've climbed the ladder in Canada to win Mr. BC, Mr. Vancouver, Mr. BC as a junior, and then climbed into the senior level, and then been lucky enough and to have the knowledge base and the tools to get lean enough and technical enough to win overall titles in each of those categories every time I jumped the level, all the way into the IFBB North American Championships in '92. So at that point, I was studying human nutrition and utilizing the laboratories where I was studying to monitor my progress. So the progress I achieved personally was really a scientific-driven system that I was able to optimize and then create nutritional products from that were sent to market years later. So in the last part of my life, I began an initiative to complete a doctorate, and the doctorate was to really compile the research that I had instigated over the last 2 decades actually, on my own, that I'd funded through various companies of mine that were marketed in the industry. And I reached roadblocks in terms of the discovery and the study of the disease pathology in relation to these pharmacologies. So lo and behold, I engaged in the Faculty of Medicine at University of British Columbia as a mature student to develop further a thesis on inflammatory cascades and how polyphenol compounds could be incorporated into recovery programs. So here I am today presenting to you patents that have risen out of this technology and this study. So just out of conflict of interest awareness, I need to post this statement saying that I am the owner of IPs. That is also one that has vested interest in these IPs. And for the ethics committee at the academic organization, that is necessary. So we're going to talk about performance with a compound that I've developed and patented called Ketoba. And Ketoba is a beta-hydroxybutyrate butyric acid combination. Very different than your common beta-hydroxybutyrate medium-chain triglyceride combinations that are used today as ketogenic inducers. We're going to talk about why ketosis is important in some people's lives, what it can do and why we do it. So, ketosis is kind of a misunderstood concept. And the fact is that many people have been led to believe that if they enter this state of ketosis, they're automatically burning fat. And the reality is that if you engage in a ketogenic diet, a diet of low carbohydrates that also monitors your protein, because protein can be gluconeogenic, which means that the amino acids in a protein itself can be converted by the liver into a glucose source if the body's panicking and has scarcity of glucose. So, engaging in a ketogenic diet is not that easy. It's quite difficult and quite restrictive. But once you get there, it's actually a cruise because it's the first 3 to 5 days that are very difficult for most people. And what happens during those 3 or 5 days is that the body's actually utilizing fat, whether it's from dietary sources or even body fat sources. And the liver then is, through beta oxidation, creating ketones from this fat, so the brain can use ketones. And most of the tissues in the body can use ketones as well. But typically, these ketones serve the brain. And the challenge is that if you engage in a ketogenic diet, there's a 3 to 5 day lay period for most people who are trying to get into this ketosis, the state of ketosis, where ketone levels are still too low to sustain the body and the brain. And you get this flu-like symptom, this drag and lag that's very difficult to live with. So going back to the question is, what is ketosis? Ketosis is really defined by an elevated level of ketones. And typically, these ketones should come from endogenous fats, fats that are within your body, or dietary fats. And the body will convert those fats into ketones. Now, most of us actually in basal levels will have 0.2 millimolar level of these ketones in our blood. But if we raise that above 0.2, we're said to be in ketosis. And today, we've seen this influx in the industry where there's these exogenous sources of ketones, so a supplement where you're going to take a ketone orally instead of expecting your body to synthesize or create this ketone through beta oxidation. And many companies have been tooting the fact that when we raise ketone levels, serum ketone levels, you're burning fat from an exogenous source of ketone. But it's very confusing because when we raise levels, your serum ketone levels from an exogenous source of ketone, you are not relying on your body to oxidize your own fat to create the ketone. The ketone is coming from an exogenous source, so you're not really burning fat. So we're going to talk a little bit about that and how we can manage a program that will support fat loss, that will support energy enhancement through an exogenous source of ketone, and where it fits in the diet, even with ketogenic diets. So we talked a little bit about protein and how valuable the monitoring and the correction of the protein intake needs to be in a proper ketogenic diet. And this is a bit of a problem because what happens for athletes who are intensely involved in physical activity, you're kind of sitting on the fence when it comes to ketogenesis, because if you want to go into a ketogenic diet, whether it's for therapy or just because it makes you feel good, makes you feel aware, cognitively sharp, the fact is that if you're training intensely, you need a higher level of protein. You need high biological value protein to recover and supply protein at a rate in which your body needs it for regeneration. So you're kind of caught between this conundrum where you may have to resort some days to taking, or some periods in the day, to taking more protein than you're used to, and that may push you out of ketosis. So this is where exogenous ketones become great tools, because really, there's two ways to induce ketosis, and one is through nutritional ketosis through dietary means, where we drop carbohydrates, raise fat, and then mediate our protein sources. But really the fact is that we can take an exogenous source that helps us get to the point through the diet that is more tolerable. Because the first 3 days are very difficult for someone who's trying to get into ketosis. The second thing is that when you're in ketosis, you're going to have fluctuations because there's so many factors in the environment in your life that will affect how the ketones function and how your metabolism actually will maintain a ketotic state. And so, exercise, stress, all these things will actually affect how ketones are produced in the body. And so if you have missed days, or you have carbohydrates that have entered or infiltrated your diet without you knowing it, suddenly you're out of ketosis and you're bouncing back and forth. And that can make it very difficult for some people who are trying to stay in ketosis and stay focused. And so by taking an exogenous ketone, you create a buffer zone. And by taking an exogenous ketone that is coupled to butyric acid, the butyric acid acts as a metabolic prompt to keep the liver in the on position in terms of beta oxidation. And so if your diet is fluctuating, whether you know it or not, in terms of the ketogenic diet, at least by having a buffer zone where ketones are maintained steady, the individual who's trying to stay in a ketotic or in ketosis will have a sufficient amount of ketones to keep them cognitively aware, in control of the diet, and to maintain a level of physical activity and mental activity that's sufficient. Now, there's some important research that I've been involved in recently at Biologic Pharmamedical at our research lab that involves the signaling mechanisms of ketones. And this is where exogenous ketones come to play for people who are involved in the ketogenic diet or not. And this is really neat because it gives you an understanding of why these ketones and how these ketones could work for you to actually trigger receptors. This is the signaling mechanisms in our bodies. These receptors are actually attached sometimes to various mechanisms genomically. And my work in the lab is really to discuss it, or to map what that genomic activity is, what the proteomic activity is. Meaning, there's a receptor on the outside of the cell, you have a ligand that attaches to it. What's the map that leads to a genomic trigger where the genes now respond to change the behavior of the cell? And in fact, ketones do that. Ketones actually have receptor sites that they're associated with. So BHB is associated with HCA receptors. It's hydroxycarboxylic acid receptor. And this is commonly understood, but what is not understood is what is the true mechanism after that receptor site is triggered by the ketone that creates an anti-inflammatory effect and affects the cell in a way that causes it to protect the body, or protects itself, the mitochondria, the DNA. And this is very interesting because these receptor signaling pathways have been associated with what we call FFAR, like free fatty acid receptors. And those receptors are actually responsible for the oxidative state. So beta hydroxybutyrate as well as BA. So remember that beta hydroxybutyrate is our ketone, and BA is our butyric acid, our short chain fatty acid. They actually are ligands for common receptors, so they will trigger similar receptor sites. So in other words, we can actually use BA on its own to trigger some of them, or a combination to have a compounding effect. So what's the value in that? We're going to talk a little bit about, and I'll show you some of the research that we've done in our laboratory that shows when you trigger some of these receptors, we get the activation of a transcription factor called NRF2. I'll talk about NRF2 and what it means. But NRF2 is a transcription factor that triggers the synthesis of various compounds in our cells. And you'll know what these compounds are when I talk about them. SOD, superoxide dismutase, catalase, glutathione peroxidase, hemoxygenase. And we know that when we raise the level of these antioxidants, we raise the cell's capacity to tolerate stress in the environment, including oxidative stress that may result from physical work. So when you increase the cell's capacity to resist oxidative stress, you improve its capacity to be able to resist hard training. Oxygen deprivation. In fact, these strategies are now being used in cases of stroke where people have had one stroke, and they use these NRF2 activation systems or hemoxygenase activation systems to prevent tissue damage in the heart as well as in the brain. So in stroke in the brain, and then cardiomyopathies in the heart, to prevent the damage that's caused by oxygen deprivation in case you have a second stroke. Because once you have one, you're usually vulnerable to two, or heart attack, you're usually vulnerable to two. So the other benefits that we have by activating these systems that protect our cells, that enhance endogenous antioxidants, is that we tend to actually preserve cognitive function. We preserve, heart function. It creates an anti-inflammatory effect because oxidative stress correlates highly with inflammation. Inflammation, as it escalates, actually contributes to oxidative stress and free radical generation, and vice versa. So there's a cyclical activity. So the interesting thing is that we also, with butyric acid, combining it in this system, create a program or system in the supplement that helps to reduce blood sugar, because we know that BA actually helps clear blood sugar in insulin-resistant subjects. It improves insulin function. And so what we're trying to create in this system is a program by which we actually drop glucose in the blood and allow the serum ketone then to be more prevalent. And if we do that and keep the button pressed all the time, whether you're on a ketogenic diet or not, you're helping people with metabolic syndrome. You're helping people stay in that, ketone prevalent state in the body. And again, this is a very difficult thing to control over time as you during the week or at work you might have more structure. I know for me during the weekend I have less structure in my diet because I'm at home with the kids. The kids want to do one thing or another, but this allows me to create consistency metabolically as opposed to being controlled completely from my environment. So, let's talk a little bit about fat loss and ketones. And I talked a little bit earlier about this subject matter, but let's go in deeper and determine, how this works in the body and why the misinformation is misinformation about weight loss and ketones. Ketones themselves actually serve as ATP substrates, and that means that if they're used by our cells to create ATP, it means you need to burn those calories off. So if you take extra ketones throughout the day and you're piling them in high doses and thinking you're losing weight, you're actually adding calories. You're adding nutrition, really a macronutrient, so to speak, that needs to be burned off. The second thing is that research shows unequivocally that when you raise serum ketone levels, you actually inhibit lipolysis. And so it's a feedback mechanism in our bodies that's built in order to protect you from extreme ketone generation, is to protect you from ketoacidosis. And so what is happening there is as serum ketone levels rise, the body's saying, hey, hold on a sec, we have enough. And you can see this feedback mechanism here on the slide. We have enough ketones in the blood, and it comes up and inhibits lipolysis so that the fat cells are releasing fewer triglycerides so that they're not available for oxidation. So, there are some side effects that are minor in the context of exogenous ketones today, but we don't know for sure in the long run how that's going to play out, although most of the research is showing that most of the side effects or disturbances are really as a function of gastrointestinal disturbances associated with the BHB, the high sodium load typically associated with these supplements, and medium chain triglycerides. Now, the BHB MCT, or medium chain triglyceride combination, is a fabulous combination for ketosis. The only challenge is that we find there are too many people that react adversely to the MCT and BHB concentration used in this system, and you have GI distress. I mean, I was led to this issue mainly because I'm more sensitive than other people to that distress because I have ulcerative colitis. And while I was competing, I had this gastrointestinal disturbance that kept coming and going and was really affected by using these supplements in very high doses. But what worked for me regardless is using BA as an alternative, and this was years and years ago. So butyric acid became my solution to my problem, not realizing at the time that this was a common problem for people in general with regards to the medium chain triglyceride. And so the interesting thing is that, BA, butyric acid, is also an anti-inflammatory for the gastrointestinal cells. So the mucosal lining cells, the colonocytes in particular. So they can, and BA also serves, this is butyric acid, also serves as an ATP substrate for those colonocytes. So you can see how BHB, the ketone, and BA have common applications that work synergistically and in compounding ways. So what's the value then, again, of the exogenous ketone in a program? Even with a ketogenic diet, there is value. And we've seen it in people using it in strict ketogenic diets where they have to come off the ketogenic diet for a day just for personal reasons, and this allows you a buffer zone. And it also then allows people to get back into a ketogenic metabolic state without going through that flu symptom and the lag that's associated with a lack of ketones while your body's switching gears and switching to that the ketone as a primary ATP substrate. So I talked a little bit about the ketone and fat loss, and here's a slide coming again where fat loss is something that we don't like to claim, and it's simply because we know that if people are using too much of the ketone, it's adding calories, it's adding an inhibitor for lipolysis. But BA comes into play a little bit differently. We believe that what we're seeing in our research is that the short-chain fatty acid coupled to the butyric acid allows you to use less of the exogenous BHB, so you don't have to rely on as much of it. Secondly, we know that the butyric acid also will support glucose clearance, as I mentioned earlier, to allow that BHB to be more prevalent, regardless of whether you've consumed some carbohydrates or not. We've got a bit of a comparison chart here, where the biggest question that kind of irks me is the one that we get about raspberry ketones, because raspberry ketones are in the marketplace and have done well. I think Dr. Oz has done a great job of marketing raspberry ketones for weight loss, and really the evidence supporting raspberry ketones for weight loss is weak, if at all existent. But the raspberry ketone is a substance that's really used as an aromatic. And because people believe that it functioned in a similar way and had a similar structure or homology to synephrine, that it might have some kind of a noradrenergic activity to burn fat, and it surely doesn't do that. So the ketones we're talking about today are very different than that, and I know I see people in the audience that are well aware of that. We have these ketones we're talking about are biological ketones that are generated inside our body. These are not, plant-derived. These are ketones that the body is supposed to generate in times of scarcity. And typically in the industry, we've seen that there are two main patent types, and one couples the ketone to the MCT, the other one couples the ketone to the short-chain fatty acid, and this is the one we're talking about today. They both have applications in the environment and in different people's different lifestyles. For me, as I said earlier, the MCT didn't work. It just was too disruptive of the gastrointestinal tract. And so what happens is, it's funny how these things kind of lead you down different paths, because for the rest of my life, I began to study the BA and the ketone as the main functional compound for me to serve as a pre-workout system. And it wasn't until about 5 years ago that I began the actual serious, in-depth pharmacological study in a drug lab to demonstrate how it worked. So I've got a table here that we've put on our website that really discusses how these products work and how they compare with different systems that are advocated in the marketplace. We don't see any gastrointestinal adversity with our product. It's been launched in the marketplace. People are getting great results. We've got science that supports it. But another key factor that I think people need to keep in mind is this sodium factor. And it's another one that's kind of a misinformation that's seeded in the marketplace, because these ketones are actually salts of either sodium, potassium, magnesium, and calcium. And what I've endeavored to do is to create a balance so that we have a built-in electrolyte system. So if the ketone is being offered to an individual who's an athlete, they want to make sure their electrolytes are balanced. So the ketone's automatically delivering that as a blended salt. But one of the challenges is that the sodium salt ends up being the cheaper one to buy. So many companies are relying on the sodium salt as the prevalent source, and they'll deliver 1,000 or 1,300 milligrams, as much as that sometimes, in each dose. And that's a bad thing. I mean, I don't care if you're a strong athlete working out every day. That's a lot of, in fact, 1,300 milligrams of sodium is equivalent to about a heaping teaspoon of table salt when you include the chloride anion. So the other thing is that the research shows that the absence of the chloride anion in the sodium without the sodium chloride makes it even worse, because the chloride anion has other health benefits that offset the sodium. So, I mean, we know the sodium story. It's a bit controversial in the marketplace because some people say it's important as an electrolyte, and sure it is. But, I think it's better to use salt if you need sodium in your diet, as opposed to supplementing with something that has a side load of sodium. Second thing is calories. A lot of the calories we talked about will contribute to and offset your initiative to lose weight. We've got in Ketoba, the typical serving size is a 50-calorie serving size. So it's enough to initialize a fasting workout, but not enough to have you overcome the 200 calories in a dose in a workout, because typically if you're on a treadmill, you're going to run for an hour and maybe lose between 500 and 700 calories if you're running hard at 700. And to have to overcome an extra 200 for most people is a tall, for me even. I don't want to run an extra hour just to overcome the calories that I've consumed in a pre-workout system. So it seems to work quite well. And in this slide, I've actually disclosed, the nature of the nomenclature, keto being the ketone and Ba being the butyric acid. And this is a function of the brainchild of this man in the back. He came up with the name, and I thought it was great. So, I mean, here's some features of butyric acid. A lot of people know that butyric acid is a short-chain fatty acid that is derived from the fermentation of fibers by the probiotic culture of the gut. And the fact is that when you engage in a ketogenic diet, you also are at risk of consuming a lower fiber diet, because your carbs are limited, and so there's a risk of also disrupting the probiotic culture. So in this case, then you have a synergistic system built in, and the built-in system is the butyric acid itself actually serves, one, as an anti-inflammatory, but it changes the pH of the colon, and the pH of the colon that is established with it is conducive to voiding pathogens. So pathogens cannot survive very well in that pH, and it improves the environment for the healthy microbiota. So we've talked about BA being an NF-kappa B inhibitor, which means it's an anti-inflammatory at a subcellular level. Stimulates beta oxidation. And the other cool thing it does is it stimulates a compound called glucagon-like protein. And this GLP-1 is kind of the, well, I wouldn't say the latest. It's been around and studied expansively for the last 9 years or so. But it's actually one that improves insulin function, improves appetite control, and really, in this case, then demonstrates why BA has been shown to improve appetite control. Mice, for example, that we feed BA, butyric acid, to regularly are leaner than mice that are not, and nothing else changes in terms of the diet. They eat less food. There's better appetite control. Butyric acid, interestingly enough, there's been some research on autism linking it to a lack of butyric acid and an escalation of propionic acid in the brain. And that's where these gases, or these, because they're called volatile fats, or these short-chain fatty acids from the gastrointestinal tract can penetrate to actually affect every system in your body. As I mentioned earlier, insulin. We know now that butyric acid affects brain function and neurogenesis in the brain. We know that butyric acid, when it's escalated, reduces propionic acid, and propionic acid is another short-chain fatty acid that if it exists at very high levels, we find that it correlates with people that have autism. So as soon as you actually drop propionic acid and raise butyric acid, the symptoms in autism and Asperger's individuals tend to decline and they have better control. So whether that's a function of a direct interaction of a receptor or it's an indirect activity, we know that there's positive benefits cognitively for ADD patients, things like that. So it's a pretty neat system that is designed to target many individuals that may have cognitive problems, weight problems, and need a performance product that can function very well, especially as a fasting system. You know, I talked earlier about NRF2. I have to say I love, NRF2. Most people don't know about it, but I'm intensely focused on studying it, and the more you know about it, the more you think, well, why don't people know about it? But, you know, this is a transcription factor. Has anybody here heard of NF-kappa B? Yeah, you have. So everybody, it's kind of funny because even people who do research or read research always run into NF-kappa B. It's a central transcription factor for as many as 150 genes that regulate immune system activity and inflammatory activity. But NRF2 is just as important because on the other side, NRF2 controls our endogenous antioxidant system. And you know, in our industry, in the nutraceutical industry, there's this pledge to try and improve antioxidant status in the body by delivering high ORAC value compounds. ORAC value meaning oxygen absorbance capacity, right? So oxygen radical absorbance capacity. And so therefore we have this outside in work by an antioxidant to affect the body in a positive way, yet you know, it's very hard to penetrate the cell and have the cell produce antioxidants endogenously inside that protect the mitochondria, that protect the DNA, because those exogenous antioxidants we consume really can't penetrate at an intracellular level to deliver a result. So, having said that, the ketone actually activates NRF2, improves the antioxidant level of these endogenous antioxidants to preserve your cells and prepare you for physical work. So, helps protect you from stress. This is some of the work, the preliminary work that we did in our lab recently. I haven't prepared all of it for this event because it's being published. So this was the preliminary work before we did our final data for our paper. And it shows that, you know, once you get to 0.8 millimoles, which isn't very much, 0.8 millimoles of ketones, for most people who are in ketosis, they're in excess of 2 millimoles. But at 0.8 millimoles, NRF2 levels are at peak. So you get about 25% more NRF2 activity and endogenous antioxidant potential. And in cells that are stressed with LPS, lipopolysaccharide, which is a common stressor that we use in the lab, we even get an incremental level of this NRF2 as a protective feature. So we know that, you know, in order to have the ketones serve as an ATP substrate, the levels need to be much higher than 0.8 millimoles, anywhere in excess of 1. But, and for many people, they like to be in excess of 2 or 3. But this level alone gives you a preservation system, whether you're working out or not, or whether you're doing things that you think may expose your cells to stress, that allows the body to function at better efficiency. So here we go with our slide on ketones. Do they burn fat? And that's an absolute no. And I've been emphatic about this 2 or 3 times, and I think you expressed an acknowledgement of that in the booth when we were talking, because I just want to make it clear in the industry, you know, we're in the exogenous ketone space with a very unique strategy, but we know that, you know, this is kind of a a delicate situation because people don't need to be misinformed in order for us to sell a product for weight loss. You know, we want to sell a product that benefits people in ways that, you know, they know about, that we are truthful about, and we know the ketone can serve people in many ways that are beyond fat. But, and you know, the thing is that we are getting reports from people using this, and it's on Facebook, and they're losing, the first week, losing 1 pound a day of weight using the product. You know, and I call on them just to understand more about their lifestyle, because the reality is, and you know this very well, if you start a ketogenic diet after being carbohydrate loaded the rest of your life, or prior to that, you can lose 1 pound a day for a week because you're losing glycogen and water as a function of your depletion of glycogen before you actually hit ketosis. So, you know, I'm talking to these people, then 2 weeks later, they're still losing weight. It's a slower rate. And, you know, it's nice to see, but usually it's a function of taking the ketone and changing your diet because you can. Not a function of the ketone directly causing you to lose weight as much as it is putting you in control of your diet so that you can stay in control as opposed to being impulsive about your eating. So, and that's where the butyric acid comes into play because it supports appetite control phenomenally. I mean, when I take my dose after a pre-workout, I have to make sure I take my post-workout meal because if I don't and I'm rushed, I'll forget. And then I have to go find something as quickly as possible because we know we go into that catabolic state or prevent anabolism if we're not supplying nutrition at a rate that's functional. So Ketoba is really, I think, we're at ground level, and we're looking to really serve people with a product that can help change their lives in that product. There's my conflict of interest statement again, so everybody's aware. But we're also here to show people about recovery. And I have to say that the BDM30 is kind of the product that's, you know, my baby. It's been researched by me for 9 years, and you know, it started for me when I was in university and had these gastrointestinal problems, and using curcumin in general to serve as an anti-inflammatory product, which took the edge off the colitis, but really, you know, couldn't clear it because it's a difficult disease. It's an autoimmune disease delivered to you by a mutation and other environmental factors that trigger the activity of the mutation. But the fact is that, you know, sometimes it worked, and then when I began to study the different curcumins that I would purchase in the lab, I determined that, you know, the curcumin, for example, that's in our marketplace is a 95% extract that we typically find. We can find anywhere from 50 to 95%. But the fact is that there are curcuminoids within that 95%, 3 main curcuminoids. And I'll show you what those are. Those 3 main curcuminoids will fluctuate from one batch or one lot number to another. So even though you have a 95 every time, the internal fluctuation of these curcuminoids changes the pharmacology of that overall curcuminoid. So that's what I began to study. Why? And how can we manage that so it's always standardized? You know, in the context of weight management, or in the context of weightlifting, bodybuilding, or looking to build muscle, I mean, this is an important feature. Because we know, first of all, the skeletal muscle is one of the most adaptable tissues that we have on our body, in our body. And, you know, if we stress the muscle, the microtrauma then allows for growth. We know that process to be anabolic. And the system is actually highly regulated by chemistry of inflammation. In fact, every disease, even aging, is actually managed and regulated by inflammatory chemistry. So we can manage inflammation. We can manage a lot of things. We may not be able to clear and treat every disease, but we can take the edge off a lot of diseases that depend on the chemistry to survive. And so, you know, I began to use this strategy early on in my bodybuilding career, and that was to manage inflammation. Because if inflammation is prolonged, then you prolong your recovery potential. So as soon as you can alleviate inflammation, you can go back to training your body part more frequently. And over the year, that makes a big difference. So a guy who's going to compete, you know, 2 years down the road and has been able to train, you know, in 1 month the body part 3 more times, theoretically should be further ahead. And that was my strategy at the time. It's like whether it worked or not, I didn't care. It just felt good because I knew I can get in there more often. And, you know, it worked for me, whether that was what it worked for me. I mean, you have a genetic component working for you, many things that are working for you at the same time. But for me, I was a bit of a geek going back to school to try and determine what's the mechanism that drives the difference in activity with all these curcuminoids that are all 95. So I began to isolate these curcuminoids and use them individually. And here you can see on this slide, you've got curcumin 1, curcumin 2, curcumin 3. Typically, curcumin 1 exists at up to 80% concentration, 2 between 10 and 20, and 3 is only in there at about 0.2 to 0.1. 0.2 to 1, sorry. Sometimes I put a 2% because I've seen a 2%, but usually you don't get over 1. So what I found was that I had some batches that I was using that got up to about 3 to 4%, and those ones seemed to work well. So upon isolating the 3 curcuminoids and using them individually, every time I used curcumin 3 in pure form, it worked irrefutably to completely resolve my condition. And so that led then to the study. And you know, here's one of the slides, which is just going to publication in the medical journal, and has been held back in order for the patent to be filed. So the patent's now filed. But you can see here that these are the different curcumins, and here's curcumin 1, 2, and 3, and this is a protein called MSK1. And this is MSK1. Have you heard of MSK1? You may have read about it if you're reading research. MSK1 is a stress protein that's a kinase inside our nucleus. Okay, so it actually exists in the cytoplasm and in the nucleus. And NF-kappa B, typically, in order for it to be active, has to translocate from the cytosol into the nucleus, where it can attach to the promoter of a gene and then transcribe the cytokines that are inflammatory. But NF-kappa B depends on MSK1 to phosphorylate it and turn it on. So even if it translocates successfully, it cannot function until you turn it on with this phosphorylation by MSK1. Now, the interesting thing is that autoimmune diseases and cancers that are drug resistant have been found, many of them, to have escalated MSK1 levels. So the system is mutated somehow or dysfunctioning, and this dysregulation of MSK1 is contributing to a drug-resistant state. So drug pharma has really been studying MSK1 to try and find targets that inhibit it, so that if they use, say, a drug for cancer, and then the cancer comes back with elevated MSK1 levels, if they can neutralize MSK1, then potentially the drug that worked the first time can be functional again. And so non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, for example, is characterized by elevated MSK1, which creates constitutive activity for NF-kappa B. What that means is that it's causing NF-kappa B to stay on, instead of it working when it's supposed to. Right? And so many of these diseases are associated with different mutations that allow NF-kappa B to be constitutive. So the cool thing is then, curcumin 3 does this, but none of the other curcumins do it, curcuminoids. So curcumin 3 inhibits NF-kappa B, like the other ones do, plus, if you use it at full concentration, it inhibits MSK1. And now you take both legs off of that process instead of one, you see? And so, because we can associate this with, I'm here talking today about, you know, the releasing of anabolic potential based on inflammation, but it's far beyond that. I mean, I'm talking about, you know, colitis, Crohn's, and diseases like that, that we still have to study clinically in those contexts. But I can tell you stories already that we're not supposed to talk about because they're not clinically approved for discussion. But it's just unbelievable, you know. So I talked about the MSK1 as an activator. And there it is right there, activating P65. This is NF-kappa B that I talked about, and then it allows it to produce its cytokines. And we don't need to go into those kind of details. I'm sure that nobody needs to see that stuff. But here's another cool thing that kind of blew us away, and it was accidental finding. So we know that if you look on this scale here I have ORAC values. And these ORAC values were actually done by an independent company, not by us, in order for us to be credible in the process. Hopefully incredible. So, I mean, we know astaxanthin to have tremendous ORAC value. We know curcumin 95 has great ORAC value. Look at this. This is BDM 30. Now, the reason why I haven't put it BDM, I don't know why that BDM is not in there on its own. I think we picked the wrong slide. But BDMC, that curcumin 3, has an ORAC value of 6 million. Curcumin 95 on its holistic form has an ORAC value that's somewhere around, you know, was it 4,500? So little bits, you throw that in a product that is designed to be ORAC oriented or ORAC leveraged. You just put 100 milligrams and suddenly you have, you know, 500,000 ORAC value. It's unbelievable. And it's probably, I'm saying probably because we don't know the mechanism, one of the ways it might be working in that inflammatory and anti-inflammatory cascade. Although I've found a mechanism that's directed to a protein, it could be a secondary effect by the ORAC value that's affecting that protein downstream. Although, no, that's not true, because I did find an upstream target. So I did find an upstream target I'm not talking about here, but I can talk about in other work where it's a you've heard of microRNAs? Yeah. Well, microRNAs are kind of like, you know, the sexy subject that's latest and greatest. And these microRNAs, do you want to hear about that? Yeah, okay. I don't want to bore you guys with the unnecessary details. But okay, so microRNAs are thought to be little snippets of DNA that have become part of our own DNA from viruses long ago. And these little snippets are like 22 nucleotide long sequences that really are non-coding, meaning they don't code for any protein in particular. But what happens is when this microRNA is released into the cytosol, it actually is designed and coded to bind to messenger RNA that's come off of our DNA. Do you know that system? So the messenger RNA then is translated into a protein which can be functional or dysfunctional or whatever. The cool thing is that this microRNA that I'm studying, microRNA 148A, binds to the messenger RNA that's supposed to be encoding for MSK1. And that's how it slows down the translation of MSK1. But the coolest thing is that that mechanism is also now known to escalate LDL receptors on our cells to clear LDL from our blood. So it actually demonstrates a new patented mechanism by which curcumin 3 can be applied for LDL clearance, which is phenomenal, you know, for our industry to supply a natural compound that can clear LDL as well as many, you know, drugs that may have side effects. Now, again, we're looking at doing more clinical work to be able to make the claims directly, but we have the research now showing the mechanism irrefutably. And it's patent protected. So there again, I want to highlight the conflict of interest statement so everybody's aware that I own the IPs that I'm talking about and that I'm trying as much not to be biased with my excitement, but to deliver facts that I think are valuable. And we'll go into a question and answer period if you have any questions.
So you talked earlier about polyphenols and how... So earlier you talked about polyphenols and how they mediate inflammation. Do you think that's because they're actually irritants, if you will?
That's
so
interesting. Hello? Knock, knock, knock. That's an interesting question. So the mechanism we just discovered clearly indicates that it's not an irritant. It's more like a pharmacological agent. But I like, and I think you mentioned this, and I kind of glossed over it a little bit because I was kind of busy in the booth thinking about other things while I was talking to you. But your question about NRF2. So what you're saying right now about an irritant and escalation of NRF2 could be a fit. Because if you think about it, when we find NRF2 is activated by a ketone, you wonder, is this now response by the cell protecting it from a potential irritant? Or is this a natural design where it's a mechanism, a signaling mechanism that says to the cell, look, we're under starvation, we're in stress mode, so be prepared for something to happen. So it raises endogenous levels. But in pharma science, whenever we actually condition a cell, whether by irritating or not, we condition a cell to be prepared for an environmental attack by raising those antioxidant levels. In order to really determine if there's damaging effects to the cells, we have to do other things to say, are the cells actually proliferating or not surviving now? So we did that. We did MTT assays. So MTT assays will demonstrate whether the cell is in survival mode and functioning well because we measure a metabolite of the cell's metabolism, or it's declining. So we'll do MTT assays with a toxin that kills the cells versus the compound that we saw raises NRF2. If it's creating stress that's deleterious to the cell, then you should see your MTT scores going down, meaning the cell's metabolism starting to shut down, we're damaging the cell, it's not working, right? And so with these MTT assays being functional, we're demonstrating, no, the cells are still healthy, we're activating NRF2, but no deleterious effects to slow down metabolism or kill off cells, and survival rate is actually measured by that as well. Yeah.
And are MTT assays a measure of autophagy or no?
So they're a measure of, it's a metabolic byproduct of a chemical that we actually put in the cell that's a direct measure of mitochondrial and other activities that are function in the cell. So we have a baseline that we know in controls, and then we have the rest of our cells. And we measure 100% survival rate versus all the way down to 0. And we know with the concentration, we use the same concentration we're using in dosing, and we use a concentration curve. And so what happens in this case is that the concentration that we're using is not showing an MTT assay score that's reflective of damage and kill off of our cells. Yeah. Oh, you got a series of questions.
Oh, yeah,
Awesome.
you sort of actually answered this in terms of how NRF2 affects endogenous antioxidants. So it's interesting. There's really two systems. There's the irritant system, and then there's the other, which really is not acting as an irritant. I always think of creating endogenous like superoxide dismutase with polyphenols. People think of fruits and vegetables as being good for you, but maybe one of the reasons they're good for you is because they're bad for you. And it's interesting how you covered both angles there, which I've never.
Yeah, you know,
thought
once
about.
you see that, I mean, you're a thinker, because I mean that's how. Are you involved in actual pharmacological research or anything? Or,
Yes.
yeah, yeah, because I mean that's the first thing you do. You see a response like that, and then you try to determine, well, is the cell suffering now, or is this just a conditioning response? And so now you got to measure the health of the cell through markers that are independent of the system you're actually measuring.
And earlier you talked about butyric acid acting on the liver to sort of tamp things down. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that, because I didn't understand. I think what it's doing is you're saying it's having an effect on glucose. It's pushing it down. But could you just talk a little bit about how that works?
Well, it does two things. One is that it actually inhibits the output of glucose by the liver. So that, you know, if you have someone who's a diabetic, and oftentimes, you know, diabetes has many different mutations that contribute to this escalation of blood sugar or misregulation of blood sugar. Sometimes it's an insulin mutation. And there's about 100 or so different insulin mutations. That an insulin is a peptide that has three-dimensional configuration. And if you have a mutation, say of amino acid that's misrepresented, so like say a nucleotide mutation, the amino acid might be misplaced with another one. What happens is it changes the three-dimensional configuration of the peptide. And this is kind of a cool. When you think about, you know, how this works mechanically, it's kind of like, wow, that's so simple, yet in a complex, you know, biological system. Here's the neat thing. So, for example, the metabolisms that are different in all of us are really a function of these what we call SNP, single nucleotide polymorphisms, that can alter slightly the amino acid profile and function of things, but not enough to make them dysfunctional. So, in other words, I may have an SNP, single nucleotide polymorphism, that changes the shape just a bit of my insulin, so that yours may work just a bit better. And that way, it actually changes your entire metabolism. So now, if you have multiples of those and the configuration of insulin is really altered, it's not fitting in the receptor site very well, the GLUT4 receptor site, which is responsible for clearing blood sugar, right? And so now, what happens in that case is that you need more insulin. So the pancreas is then, every time you eat sugar, has to pump out more. But eventually, as you get older, and oxidative factors roll into play and the body starts to get slower, that turns into diabetes and insulin resistance. But your degree might be different than mine based on which nucleotide has been messed up in that mutational system, right? So this is kind of interesting. But then you have other forms of diabetes that are a function of the liver producing way too much glucose and pumping it constitutively into the blood. So regardless of what your insulin's doing, it just can't keep up. So BA kind of works in a very cool way by limiting the output or the gluconeogenic effect in the liver, which then works well for us in the context of protein. Then works well for us also because it activates beta oxidation. So now, this is a bit of a problem, because if BA is starting to activate beta oxidation and you're eating sugar, it's really going to be turned off by a feedback mechanism. But if you're on a carb-restricted diet, it's going to support a ketogenic effect, right?
Yeah, that's actually interesting. So, and do you think Pima Indians have more of these polymorphisms as
They do.
For example?
They do. And that's why they're, in fact, I've wrote, in one of my book, I use them as a case model. The Pima Indians have an extremely high rate of diabetes and metabolic syndrome. And, you know, at first it was associated with, you know, there are some research says, well, they have evolved from a state where they're always in scarcity. So the metabolism, the evolution of those people is such that they have to survive with optimized metabolism, meaning that now if you actually add too many calories to that optimized metabolism, you're vulnerable to obesity. And this is the theory that's brought into play with regards to the Pima and other models, whereby, you know, if they're sequestered in an environment where they're isolated and they're all breeding within their group, then they have a system by which then their metabolism is optimized for their culture. Bring them into our culture where we have too many carbs, it doesn't work. right?
And then the only other thing I had here, I just want to make sure I understood. You said at 0.8 millimole of ketones, NRF2 is maxed out. So anything higher than that, it doesn't really seem to.
Well, we've gone as high as 2.4, and now we're actually running another series that will go up to 3 and 4 and 5. You know, I personally, here's my opinion. My opinion is that if you want to go to 3 millimoles, you should be using a ketogenic diet. I don't believe in using these exogenous ketones to cheat you into a 3 millimolar level. And the reason is that suddenly you're in a state where you're going to be eating carbs anyway. So your 3 millimolar doesn't mean anything. So why tax your body with that? Right? This is about priming your system. It's about enhancing NRF2 levels if you want that conditioning, but not taxing your body with things you don't need in your system.
Excellent. Thank you.
We done? Good. Thank you very much.